When Legends Rise. What an album to end on. This is the worst Godsmack album. It's basically Godsmack pulling every lyrical cliche, every criticism they've ever had thrown at the band, everything I've complained about up to this point, into one record. This album also features no songwriting contributions from Shannon Larkin, Tony Rambola, and Robbie Merrill, as Sully Erna wanted to go for a more commercial approach to this album, so he hired songwriters, two of which are best known for working with Panic at the Disco, to write all of these songs, and he just had the guys play on it. They had no creative input whatsoever. Almost every single song has the exact same tempo and structure, and the lyrics on this are just terrible throughout the entire thing. This is Godsmack doing nothing to disprove the claim that they're a derivative band. The solo on Bulletproof sounds just like Decode by Paramore. Like at this point, Godsmack isn't just aping influences people said of them with like Metallica or Alice in Chains. They're straight up copying. Listen to Decode and listen to the solo on Bulletproof. It's the same thing. Unforgettable is Godsmack's attempt at borrowing from modern pop trends, notably Imagine Dragons. And that's really what this song is it's Godsmack taking an Imagine Dragons song and adding a rock shine to it. They're basically reappropriating something that already exists and making the rock version of that. It's basically Godsmack embracing every alternative metal cliche possible. I would actually say it's very reminiscent of Nickelback. To elaborate on that statement, I think the song Unforgettable sounds very much like Edge of a Revolution as well. In addition to Imagine Dragons, it also calls back to some of the most generic music made by one of rock's most generic bands. And both songs follow pretty much the same writing pattern. Taking It to the Edge sounds like a literal parody of Godsmack. Even in the title, Taking It to the Edge, it sounds like someone wrote this with the intention of making fun of Godsmack. But no, Sully Erna wrote it, and it's an actual Godsmack song. Under Your Scars calls back to like Five Finger Death Punch, I would say, being that it's a piano ballad. And I would say this is the first time when listening to Godsmack that a song actually feels pretentious. I never thought Godsmack could achieve that. But Under Your Scars is a literal pretentious song by Godsmack. As if Godsmack of all bands could ever be pretentious. I'd say the instrumentation does call back to Sully Erna's solo work, but not even enough to where it would make this song interesting. Like I said, this really feels like a Five Finger Death Punch song. And much like Unforgettable, it's just Sully Erna adding a topical rock shine to the song to fit in to the stereotypes he thinks rock music should be. You're like a shooting star in the rain is one of the dumbest lyrics I've ever heard, and I can't stand it. Someday and Just One Time sound like Godsmack, but like the commercial version of Godsmack. Just One Time in particular sounds like Call Me by Blondie. Say My Name might be the worst Godsmack song since Bad Magic, as the bridge is just laughably terrible. And it's Sully Erna basically doing that same awkward vocal impression he did on Bad Magic, to where it sounds like someone's making fun of Sully Erna. The only song I remembered liking when I first listened to this in 2018 was I Have the Storm, and that still holds true today. I Have the Storm actually does sound like a continuation off the sound they had on The Oracle and 1000 HP, and it's the only moment in this album that feels like a form of lyrical growth and musical growth. It's a good song, and it's at the end of the album, no less. I mean, I could talk a lot about all the things wrong with When Legends Rise, such as it embracing every rock cliche, or how every song sounds like it was made for the radio. I can talk about how When Legends Rise is supposedly experimental, despite nothing on this album being a form of artistic growth or ingenuity. There's nothing on here that's pushing any boundaries creatively speaking. If anything, this is a de-evolution for Godsmack. However, the one thing I want to focus on, my biggest annoyance with this album more than anything else, is it underutilizes three very talented musicians. So, from what I understand, Sully Erna was the one who put the fork in Another Animal, as he felt that band was competing with Godsmack. Godsmack takes 4 years in between albums. They always take 4 years in between records. And in the 4 years between 1000 HP and When Legends Rise, Shannon, Tony, and Robbie didn't get to make anything interesting. And even now they haven't made anything interesting because this wasn't written by them. They had nothing to do with it. This has to piss them off. I mean, during my research for this album, I feel like it upset them. I wasn't there, I don't know them personally, but I couldn't help but take notice of it. Like there's one interview of Godsmack where basically the band is answering fan questions, and it's really just Sully talking for the entire video. And during this video, Tony Rambola straight up looks like he wants to drop kick Sully Erna. Like he looks like he wants to beat the crap out of him. And I can see why, because that would annoy me too if I'm someone who's constantly writing, constantly coming up with ideas, and all my work basically got gaffled for some pop metal. When Legends Rise is a good example of why I avoided Godsmack for as long as I did. It's also a good example of why I always assumed Godsmack's discography just completely paled in comparison to that one Another Animal album. I have no idea where Godsmack will go from here. I don't know if Sully Erna is just going to constantly use songwriters per album and these guys are just going to stop writing music altogether, or if this is just a one-off thing and they're never going to do it again. And I really hope it's the latter. Like I said, I'm not invested into Godsmack, but hearing how little involvement Shannon, Tony, and Robbie had on this album even bleeds over into the music. Like one thing I always said about Godsmack is that I love the instrumentation. I always felt like there was passion, even when the songs weren't that good, that there was love being put into them. And When Legends Rise is the first example of me not feeling that. It feels standard, it feels subpar, it feels boring. It feels like a band going through the motions. It's like Godsmack's equivalent of a midlife crisis, which is funny because Godsmack sounded like they've been in a midlife crisis since they started, which just goes to show you how bad this album is. This album is boring and it adds nothing to Godsmack's discography, nor does it change my mind about how I felt regarding Godsmack. I gotta say, like, this record embodies everything I've complained about with this band, and it's just not very good. Well, that was quite an experience. It was pretty interesting nonetheless. But what's any album listening experience without an album ranking? I'd like to do a quick album review just to basically sum up this musical adventure I went on, starting from the worst Godsmack album to the best ones. At number 7, we have When Legends Rise, the go-to album for Godsmack haters, the album that embodies everything wrong with Godsmack, a complete waste of 3 very talented musicians. This album doesn't even have musical performances that were able to be highlights on past bad Godsmack albums. It's boring, it's cliche, it's inessential, just not very good at all. At number 6, we have Awake. Well, it feels like more one long song as opposed to a cohesive album from beginning to end. Also, it has Bad Magic on here, which really should make it the worst album on this list just because Bad Magic exists, but the title track and the opening song are pretty good. Regardless, it's repetitive, it's boring, it's stale, and it does nothing to change Godsmack's perception as a band for douchebags. At number 5, we have Self-Titled, which is easily the most surprising spot on this list. When I started this video, I actually thought Self-Titled would be at least in the top 3. It has an interesting production, and I will admit it's not really that derivative. It does have its own sound, but even so, it's just not very good. Outside of the 3 singles, Whatever, Keep Away, and Voodoo, it's mostly inessential, and I don't really think Godsmack even really discovered who they were on this album as they would in later records. I think the best thing about Self-Titled is more so from an observational standpoint. It's interesting to see how well the instrumentation and playing is on here compared to how stale the music actually is. At number 4, we have 4. Oh, hey. Interesting within the context of Godsmack's discography, but boring in the grand scheme of music. 4 has some very unique ideas presented by Godsmack, but being that these ideas were yielded from writer's block, in addition to willful lack of collaboration from Sully and the other guys on the rest of the album, it doesn't come out as good as it should have been. The best thing I could say about 4 is it led to the birth of Another Animal. Number 3, The Oracle. Dean DeLeo once said you can judge a band by their 5th album, and I think The Oracle is proof of that. It's a massive step in the right direction by Godsmack. It has some of their most interesting songs with What If, Love, Hate, Sex, Pain, and the title track, in addition to one of the greatest singles yielded by Godsmack with Whiskey Hangover. My biggest complaint about this album is it's very, very unbalanced, and a lot of the best things about this record, notably Whiskey Hangover and I Blame You, weren't even included in it. In fact, these songs were left off in favor of some of Godsmack's weaker material that just doesn't do much for me. But regardless, I think the band is mostly firing on all cylinders here, and this is a natural progression for Godsmack in a way that feels like they were building off the best ideas they had on some of their better material. It has a certain duality to it. While it has some of Godsmack's best music ever with Love, Hate, Sex, Pain, and What If, it also has some of their most cliche and boring songs like Crying Like a Bitch and Shadow of a Soul. So half and half on this one. At number 2, we have 1000 HP. Slightly better than I remember. A massive step in the right direction. Basically them expanding on some of the better aspects they had on the Oracle. Even if Sully Erna is coasting along lyrically, the band does gel together very well. As I've said, I think this is because of Dave Fortman. I really believe if Dave Fortman could have produced a third Godsmack album, it might even be my favorite Godsmack record, because he was gradually building these guys to something better. And Sully Erna just wasn't having that. He just had to make When Legends Rise. I would say, though, 1000 HP and the Oracle are Godsmack doing their best at incorporating the most positive attributes of Faceless and 4 into one album. As I said earlier, not getting Dave Fortman to be a producer for a third subsequent Godsmack record after the Oracle and 1000 HP was a mistake, as he did a great job at getting these guys to get better and better. He brought out a true synergy in this band, and I give him props for that. This record definitely surprised me, probably almost as much as Self-Titled, as a matter of fact. And at number 1 for the best Godsmack album, we have Faceless. Nothing new by any means, but it doesn't need to be. Sully Erna is a great songwriter. He's capable of making amazing music when he needs to be. And this album is living proof of that. Even without the creative contributions from Tony, Robbie, and Shannon, they did find chemistry with Sully's ideas, and they build upon them. They make them better, more intriguing, and stronger. This is the only Godsmack album I like from beginning to end. I think it's one of the best albums to come out of this genre, and it does leave me hopeful that they can make something this good again someday.